Because man cannot live by Nintendo alone, it's SEGAiden. VideoWorks has focused almost entirely on Nintendo systems to date, but that doesn't mean other consoles don't deserve some love. There aren't enough hours in the day for me to give my full attention to Sega or NEC or Atari, but that's okay because plenty of great series like Atari Archives and Generation 16 are already hard at work on those endeavors. That said, I would like to explore some of Sega's classics, and what better way to handle that than by tracing the releases Sega themselves crown as canon. Of all the legacy publishers in the world, Sega has been the most proactive about keeping their greats in circulation. At the moment, Sega has no less than 4 different classics projects on the market, ranging from those terrible ATGAMES mini-consoles to the fantastic Sega Ages. We're going to look at the fantastic one through its new iteration on Switch. Yes, feel free to throw some shade here about how even when Retronauts covers Sega, it's through a Nintendo lens. Go on, get it out of your system. Sega Ages for Switch is something like the 5th distinct venture to bear that name. The original Sega Ages was a collection of Genesis games released for Saturn, oddly published in the US not by Sega, but rather by Working Designs. The Ages series returned on PlayStation 2 in a series of strange and ill-conceived low-budget remakes of classic hits, which mercifully never reached the US. Rather than attempt to preserve original games like Golden Axe and Monaco GP, Sega 3D Ages reworked those classics as extraordinarily shoddy 3D versions that should never have seen the light of day. The only clever thing about the 3D Ages line was that it was created in partnership with budget developer D3. See, 3D Ages backward is D3 Sega. Womp womp. Fortunately, somewhere around Volume 2 of this disastrous venture, developer M2 stepped in and slowly began transforming Sega 3D Ages into plain old Sega Ages, taking the whole venture from misbegotten abuse of beloved properties to medium-defining reference standard for the preservation of classic games. Not only did M2 attempt to emulate classic games with absolute fidelity, they also began including all sorts of supplemental material, production notes, marketing artwork, alternate and international versions, even esoteric offshoots like the Phantasy Star text adventures. M2 carried that mindset forward to its next Sega Ages venture, the Sega 3D Classics series for 3DS. While those releases tended to be less comprehensive in terms of alternate material than the PS2 standalones, they also retailed for a third of the price while maintaining the same high-quality reproduction standards and adding a 3D visualization element, along with fun features like gyro controls for ride-on cabinets such as Super Hang-On. Obviously, Sega Ages for Switch can't include the 3D graphics, but the more powerful hardware does allow M2 to pull off other tricks that were beyond the grasp of the humble 3DS. Sega 3D Classics focused primarily on Genesis and System 16 arcade boards, but the Switch line will reportedly tackle games as advanced as Saturn and Dreamcast, which presumably puts games for the Titan and Naomi arcade boards in the running too. M2 says they're still using the Giga Drive emulation layer they developed for 3DS, but in their words, it's been powered up in various ways. One example of this is the Megaplay implementation, they tell me. That hardware was a powerful combination of Genesis and Master System that even the Giga Drive couldn't handle. So we've added a Master System to the Giga Drive too. This would use way too much power for a 3DS, so the new Switch hardware was necessary. Other than that, we've used the Giga Drive potential by adding in Sticks mode for Thunder Force 4, allowing voice and music to play simultaneously, adding Sonic's Drop Dash, and so on. The new Sega Ages series may encompass everything from SG-1000 to Dreamcast eventually, but not surprisingly, Sega is kicking it off with good old Sonic the Hedgehog. Or rather, yet another port of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog should require no real introduction at this point. It's one of the best-selling games of all time, having sold more than 40 million copies across more than half a dozen platforms. Released in 1991, Sonic was Sega's biggest gun in the fight against Nintendo's Super NES. The game shipped a matter of weeks before Nintendo's console arrived in the US, which allowed Sega to place it side by side in advertisements versus Nintendo's heavy hitter pack-in Super Mario World. Sonic's blistering speed and brilliant soundtrack made for a convincing sales pitch at retail. Super Mario World had specifically been designed to provide players with a vast, sprawling quest packed with secrets and persistent changes. And that made for a great experience at home, allowing players to chip away the challenge of finding all 96 of Super Mario World's hidden exits, but it also resulted in a slow, leisurely platformer that lacked the kinetic intensity of Sonic. Sega's designers, most notably genius programmer Yuji Naka, pulled out all the stops for Sonic, creating a platformer that could be blistering fast at times, but always left players feeling a sense of control over the action. A big part of Sonic's genius came in its multi-layered level structure. While each stage had an optimal route that would allow players to blast through the action to reach the end as quickly as possible, Sonic, like Super Mario World, rewarded players who took the time to poke around and see what lay outside the critical path. Many stages contained entire enormous sections consisting of alternate routes, bonus rings, and other goodies to seek out. It made for a game every bit as replayable as Super Mario World, but in a different way. Rather than access hidden material by scouring the world slowly, Sonic players instead needed to observe the design of each level as they hurtled along, figuring out ways to alter their momentum or change the timing of their actions in order to reach those out-of-the-way places. Sonic had an arcade vibe that perfectly fit Sega's coin-op legacy, but it also contained the depth and richness one expected in a great 16-bit home game. Sonic is a far more rough-and-tumble game than Mario. Screaming around at breakneck speeds requires leaping into the unknown, which means you're more likely to take an unexpected hit. So Sonic compensates in its design by giving the hero armor of a kind. The bonus rings you collect as you tear about aren't just analogs for Mario's coins. Instead, they're more like mushrooms. As long as Sonic holds rings, he can't be defeated by standard enemy attacks, only by special stage design elements. Take a hit and those rings go spilling out in an impressive display of 16-bit sprite pushing power, and this leaves Sonic vulnerable until he can snatch another ring, which isn't usually too tough, since you can gather up a few of your lost rings before they vanish if you're quick enough. The rings also tie into the hidden metagame. Complete a stage with 50 or more rings in hand, and a massive bonus ring appears. If you leap through that as you scream past the final checkpoint, you'll enter a bonus stage. Anyway, Sonic isn't just about speed. Sure, those spring-loaded chutes that send Sonic spinning like a pinball through tubes and tunnels leave an impression, but the game actually contains more stages that demand precision platforming than it does levels built around sheer breakneck momentum. In its slower moments, Sonic requires a deft touch. The hero, after all, is built for zipping around, so he can be a little fussy when getting about at lower speeds. Sonic is best known for those impressive dashes and his long-distance leaps into the blue, but there's more to the game than that. It contains just as many tricky underwater labyrinths or spike-lined platforming challenge zones as it does stages built around momentum. Between its cheerful Memphis-style pop art visuals, memorable tunes, and lively personality, Sonic didn't simply become a hit, it influenced an entire generation of games. The 16-bit generation was lousy with smirking animal characters promoting environmental awareness, though only a handful were actually as good as Sonic. So it makes sense for the game to lead here on Switch. M2 has expressed a desire to touch on games that have never been compiled for home release before, such as the arcade version of Gain Ground, but you can hardly blame all parties involved for kicking off with a guaranteed hit. Switch seems to be a money-printing machine, and Sonic the Hedgehog is a game very much down the Switch audience's alley. Or as Sega's internal Ages team puts it, Sonic is a major character for the company and the series has continued to this day, so the more people who play Sonic, the better. In practical terms, kicking things off with Sonic is also a good opportunity to get a baseline read on what we can expect from the Sega Ages line. This is quite likely the single most republished game in Sega's entire lineup, so there's a lot to compare it against. Is this the definitive version of the game? It certainly comes close, as it incorporates most of the improvements included in things like the Sega 3D Classics remake, besides the 3D of course. Like that version, this is not quite a full remake, but it's more than just an emulated ROM. It doesn't overhaul the game quite as much as 2013's well-loved remake for iOS. There's no widescreen mode, for example, but it does include some features that didn't appear in the original Genesis cart. Drop Dash is added to the Sonic, Sega says. It first appeared in Sonic's latest game, Sonic Mania, so it wasn't in the original Sonic. Its inclusion was the idea of Takashi Iizuka, the representative of Sonic Pillar. But adding Drop Dash to Mega Drive was a memory issue. We struggled a bit, but in the end, we're glad that we were able to implement it, and now it can be enjoyed by everyone. Given that Sonic Mania was designed by Christian Whitehead, the same person responsible for the iOS Sonic port, and Mania's producer helped steer the Ages remake, that would suggest the omission of that version's expanded feature set here is a deliberate choice rather than one born of ignorance of its existence. Sega's comments on the Ages project in general seem to back that up. Of course, we can cut out or add features, they tell me. We're pretty picky about adding new features, but also figuring out the limitations. We're meticulous about this process, so players can enjoy a faithful reproduction of the original game and its challenge, even if that challenge seems crazy by today's standards. Again, M2 says they've carried forward the Giga Drive tech that powered the 3D Classics games to Switch, upgrading it en route. Giga Drive, of course, is a play on Mega Drive, the Japanese and European name for the Genesis. As I said, the Giga Drive layer means this Sonic is neither a comprehensive remake nor just a quick and dirty ROM emulator like you see on Sega's iffy ATGAMES consoles. That means this version of Sonic is still bound, more or less, to the restrictions of the original 16-bit hardware, and the changes M2 incorporates have to fit within those limits. That said, the new Giga Drive does include a few new features that they mentioned, including support for the Mega Play arcade machine. The Mega Play was sort of like Sega's 16-bit equivalent to the Nintendo Versus line that I've touched on in NES Works, running modified versions of home games. We're not including anything like an art gallery, a Sega rep says about this port, but we've implemented the extremely rare Megaplay arcade version. There, players can really enjoy the speed of Sonic and stages designed for him to go full throttle with a time limit. Sonic titles have been migrated to other platforms multiple times, but it's the first time a version has included Megaplay. If you're familiar with Versus Super Mario Bros., the Megaplay version of Sonic will likely remind you of that. It's been subtly tweaked and remixed to be more taxing than the pure home version, with strict time limits added and 1-up monitors removed. Sega Ages allows you to play both the original Japanese and American versions of Sonic, either with or without a variety of extra features. Things like the drop dash aren't mandatory here, making for a more customizable experience than the original game. You can also access a level select mode if, like me, you're so terrible at Sonic that you've never seen the final zone without cheating. Both standard and variant play modes connect to online leaderboards too, so you can appreciate just how utterly god-awful you are compared to top-tier players around the world. You can even add in the modern ring keep feature, which causes Sonic to drop half his rings rather than all of them when you screw up, allowing for even greater padding to protect you from death in difficult situations. On the other hand, the optional ring combo counter makes you feel even worse about screwing up, because there's nothing more embarrassing than going from a ring combo count in the hundreds to 0. M2 is very much about preservation and authenticity, so you can play a pretty convincing simulation of Sonic the Hedgehog here. It sounds correct, and there's none of the input lag present in a number of other big-name Switch retro collections, names withheld to protect the innocent. The only tech issues I've noticed here is that the Megaplay version can be kinda shaky. It suffers from visual glitches, slowdown, and other minor defects. Having never encountered a Megaplay in real life, I don't know if that's a reflection of the original version, or if M2's upgraded Giga Drive needs a little more time in the oven. Also, I frustratingly found the game doesn't work with the Pro controller. I can move through menus and make system-level adjustments with the Pro, but it doesn't accept in-game inputs, something they'll hopefully correct in a patch. And finally, none of the graphical filter presets look quite as good as you'd hope. They're fine, but not revelatory. The scanline option creates lines of uneven thickness on a 1080p set, regardless of how you scale the image. So is this the definitive version of Sonic the Hedgehog? It certainly comes close. The iOS version had some great features that would have been quite welcome here, but certainly as far as classic games reworked for Switch goes, this is top-flight stuff. In short, it's another great act of classic preservation from M2, and it does what it set out to do, which is to say, get me excited for future releases that stray from the beaten path of previous Sega game preservation efforts. Special thanks this episode to Sega for providing both review code and developer feedback for this video. And when the next SEGAiden arrives, we'll have a look at the other Ages debut release, which happily does stray from the beaten path.